There is a photograph that used to hang in a government building in Kingston. In it, a small Caribbean nation of barely 2 million people stands shoulder to shoulder with two of the most powerful men on earth. On one side, the head of the world's most feared intelligence agency. On the other, the leader of a revolution the United States had spent 15 years trying to strangle in its crib. And in the middle, looking neither one of them, stood a Jamaican Prime Minister who had done something almost no small country in the Western Hemisphere had dared to do since the Second World War. He had told Washington no. This is the story of what that word cost him. It is the story of a bauxite levy that terrified American industry, a lunch in Ocho Rios that ended with $100 million vanishing overnight, and a covert campaign so extensive that when the documents finally surfaced years later, even seasoned journalists struggled to believe what their own government had done to a democracy that never fired a shot at anyone. Before this story is finished, you will understand why a nation with no army, no nuclear program, and no oil reserves became, for a few short years, one of the most closely watched countries on the planet. And you will understand why the United States government considered a 5'11" democratic socialist with a wooden staff and a law degree from London to be one of the most dangerous men in the hemisphere. Let's begin where the danger became undeniable. It is December 1975, and Henry Kissinger is not on vacation, even though every surface appearance says otherwise. The United States Secretary of State has settled into a private plantation estate on Jamaica's North Shore, in Ocho Rios, with the Caribbean Sea stretching out blue and calm in front of him. But 3,000 miles away, on the other side of the Atlantic, Angola is burning. Cuban soldiers are marching through the countryside, pushing back a South African invasion force that has driven 500 miles into Angolan territory, and Washington is not simply worried. Washington is furious, because for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, communism has a battlefield victory in a hemisphere the United States considered its backyard, and Kissinger needs the world to condemn it. He needs the Caribbean nations, small as they are, to stand at the United Nations and vote the way America has always expected them to vote. So he arranges a meeting. Not in Washington, not through an ambassador, but in person, over lunch, at Jamaica House. Sitting across the table from him is a man named Michael Manley, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, educated at the London School of Economics, son of the country's founding father, and at that moment, the single most popular political figure the island had produced since independence. The people did not just vote for Manley. They believed in him the way people believe in a preacher who has finally arrived to save them. Kissinger laid the terms on the table plainly. Jamaica needed to publicly condemn Cuba's involvement in Angola. In exchange, a $100 million line of credit was ready to be signed. For a country only 13 years removed from colonial rule, bleeding foreign currency reserves, and reeling from the 1973 oil shock, that money was not a convenience. It was oxygen. Manley looked at the most powerful diplomat on the planet and he said no. He told Kissinger that Cuban troops were the only thing standing between a newly independent Angola and an invading apartheid army. He told him this had nothing to do with communism and everything to do with which side of history a black nation in the Caribbean was going to stand on. He told him Jamaica had made its choice. The moment Manley stood up from that table, the $100 million disappeared, not delayed, not renegotiated. Gone, in Manley's own words, as if it had never been offered at all. What followed over the next 5 years would leave bodies in the streets of Kingston, expose one of the most detailed covert operations the CIA ever ran against an elected Western Hemisphere government, and raise a question historians are still arguing about today. Why did the United States treat a tiny, unarmed island nation as a genuine strategic threat? Keep listening, because the answer is more unsettling than you think, and it starts long before that lunch in Ocho Rios ever happened. To understand what Washington was actually afraid of, you have to understand who Michael Manley was before he became Prime Minister and what he was quietly building underneath all the speeches. He was born on December the 10th, 1924, into what amounted to Jamaican political royalty. His father, Norman Washington Manley, had been one of the chief architects of the island's independence movement and the founder of the People's National Party, a man whose portrait would later appear on Jamaica's $500 bill. Michael Manley did not grow up dreaming about politics. He grew up inside it, at dinner tables where the conversation was always about sovereignty, about who really owned the wealth beneath Jamaican soil, and about what it meant for a colonized people to finally stand up straight. He left for London to study economics, and there he absorbed the ideas of Fabian socialism, a British intellectual tradition that argued capitalism, left completely unregulated, was structurally built to keep poor nations poor forever. He came home from London not as an academic with theories, but as an organizer with calluses. He built the National Workers' Union into one of the most powerful labor movements in the Caribbean, and he understood something that a lot of his fellow independence leaders across the region had not fully grasped yet. Political independence meant almost nothing if foreign companies still owned the land, still controlled the minerals underground, and still shipped the profits north every single year. Before he ever held office, Manley spent years walking the docks, the factories, and the sugar estates as a labor organizer, negotiating on behalf of workers who had never once had anyone advocate for them at a table where real decisions were made. He learned, in those years, something that stayed with him for the rest of his political life, that the poor of Jamaica were not poor because they lacked ambition or discipline, but because the entire economic architecture of the island had been built generations earlier to extract value and send it elsewhere. He watched sugar workers labor from sunrise to sundown for wages that could not cover a family's basic needs, while the plantations that employed them turned steady profits for owners who had never once set foot on the property. That experience did not turn him into an academic theorist. It turned him into a man who believed, with total conviction, that political power without economic power was an illusion, a hollow independence that left the old colonial arrangements fully intact under a new flag. By the early 1970s, Jamaica was a nation sitting on a wound that refused to heal. Tourism and bauxite mining had driven real economic growth through the 1960s, but almost none of that growth had reached the people who actually lived there. Between 1962 and 1972, unemployment nearly doubled, climbing from 13% to 24%. The share of national income going to the poorest 40% of Jamaicans had not grown during that boom. It had shrunk. A small number of families controlled most of the island's wealth, while entire communities in West Kingston lived in yards fenced with corrugated zinc, watching the gap between themselves and the elite grow wider every single year. So when Michael Manley stood in front of enormous crowds in 1972 holding a wooden staff he called the Rod of Correction, a staff he claimed had been given to him personally by Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, those crowds were not simply cheering for a politician. They were calling out for deliverance. His campaign slogan was two words: better must come. And in February of 1972, the country answered him with a landslide, handing his People's National Party 37 of 53 parliamentary seats. He did not waste the mandate. He introduced Jamaica's first minimum wage. He built new schools and launched a national literacy campaign at a time when, by some estimates, nearly 80% of the population could not read, a direct and brutal legacy of decades of British colonial neglect. He extended healthcare and housing access to the rural and urban poor who had never had either. For the first time in Jamaican history, domestic workers received legal labor protections. He pushed through equal pay legislation for women. He began breaking up the sprawling sugar plantations that had defined this island's economy since the era of slavery, redistributing land to the people who actually worked it. And in September of 1974, he stood before the nation and made it official. Jamaica, he declared, was now a country of democratic socialism. These were not symbolic gestures. These were structural changes to who held power and who held wealth on that island, and they terrified the people who had built comfortable lives under the old arrangement. Jamaica's business elite began quietly moving their capital offshore. Foreign investors pulled out. Doctors, lawyers, and engineers began emigrating in numbers large enough to trigger a genuine brain drain, most of them landing in the United States and Canada. The island's conservative-owned press began running a steady drumbeat of coverage painting Manley, not as a reformer but as a communist infiltrator, despite the fact that Manley had said, publicly and repeatedly, that he was passionately opposed to communism. The word socialism became a weapon, used against him constantly, regardless of what he actually practiced in office. But none of that is what truly alarmed the United States government. What alarmed Washington was a tax. Here is what most people outside Jamaica never learned. The island sat on some of the largest bauxite reserves on the planet. Bauxite is the raw ore that gets refined into aluminum, and in the 1970s, aluminum was not a commodity. It was a strategic material, essential to American aerospace manufacturing and national defense production. For decades, massive American and Canadian aluminum companies had been extracting Jamaican bauxite under agreements that paid the Jamaican government almost nothing in return. The royalty rates were so low they bordered on insulting, a direct holdover from colonial-era economics that had never actually ended even after independence. In 1974, Manley changed the arrangement. His government renegotiated the terms with every major aluminum company operating on the island and imposed what became known as the bauxite levy, a production tax that dramatically raised the revenue Jamaica collected on every single ton of ore pulled out of its ground. Almost overnight, government revenue from bauxite increased by nearly 600%. Manley funneled that new money directly into his social programs, into schools, into health clinics, into the infrastructure his country had never been able to afford. The United States State Department noticed. This was not the first time a global South nation had tried to reclaim control over its own natural resources, and it would not be the last. But here was a small, black-lead Caribbean island looking American multinational corporations directly in the eye and telling them, "You no longer take our wealth for nothing." Somewhere inside the machinery of American foreign policy, a quiet alarm began to ring. Then Angola happened, and the quiet alarm turned into a full-blown crisis. If you have made it this far into the story, I want to ask you something honestly. Stories like this one, buried under decades of Cold War mythology, rarely make it into mainstream retellings of American history, because they complicate a narrative this country tells itself about its own role in the world. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told properly, with the receipts and the documents and the full context, then this channel exists for exactly that reason, and we are working toward 10,000 subscribers so we can keep telling them. If this is your first time here, consider joining us. Now, back to 1975, because this is where the story stops being about politics and starts being about a war fought in the shadows. In 1975, Angola stood on the edge of its own future, as Portuguese colonial rule finally collapsed after nearly 5 centuries. 3 rival factions were fighting for control of the country. Cuba threw its support behind the MPLA, a Marxist liberation movement led by Agostinho Neto. South Africa, quietly backed by the CIA, threw its support behind Neto's rivals and launched a full-scale military invasion from the south, pushing 500 miles into Angolan territory, driving hard toward the capital, Luanda. If Luanda had fallen, apartheid South Africa would have secured a military foothold deep in Central Africa, with consequences that would have rippled across the entire continent for a generation. Fidel Castro made a decision that Michael Manley would later describe as one of the bravest political acts he had ever witnessed. Castro deployed Cuban combat troops directly into Angola. They were not numerous enough to defeat the South African forces outright, but they were enough to force a confrontation the South African commanders had not planned for. Facing organized, disciplined resistance, the South African advance stalled, then pulled back. Angola held. Neto's government survived. Manley looked at what had just happened, and he made a moral judgment. He refused to walk back for the rest of his life. He saw Cuban troops as the force that had stopped a white supremacist army from carving up an African nation from the outside. He supported the intervention publicly, without hedging, without diplomatic softening. He told Kissinger directly that this was not about being anti-American. This was about being anti-apartheid. This was, in Manley's own words, the side of freedom, and Jamaica intended to stand on it. Kissinger did not see it that way, and in the months following that lunch at Jamaica House, the relationship between Washington and Kingston entered a colder and considerably darker phase. By March of 1976, American press outlets with close ties to Kissinger's State Department began running a sustained wave of negative coverage about Jamaica, portraying the island as violent, unstable, and drifting toward communism. American tourists, reading these headlines, simply stopped booking flights. Tourism revenue, one of the island's few reliable sources of foreign currency, began to collapse. The foreign exchange crisis that had already been tightening around Jamaica's neck became, in the span of a single year, a stranglehold. And, in the pots of government that do not appear in official transcripts, something considerably more dangerous was already being assembled. For decades, accusations that the CIA had actively worked to destabilize Michael Manley's government were dismissed by critics as conspiracy theory, the paranoid excuse-making of a leftist administration looking for someone else to blame for its own economic failures. Then the documents were declassified, and the documents did not lie. Beginning in 1975, the Central Intelligence Agency launched what those declassified records now confirm was an extensive, sophisticated, and sustained covert operation against Manley's government. This was not a rogue initiative run by overzealous field agents. It began under Henry Kissinger's State Department and continued, expanded even further, under Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor. Two different administrations, two different political parties in the White House, one continuous policy toward a single small island. A memo dated July 21, 1980, written by National Security Council staffer Robert Pastor to Brzezinski and later declassified under Freedom of Information requests, laid out the full architecture of what the CIA had actually been doing inside Jamaica. The document described a covert campaign that included funding media outlets to spread anti-Manley propaganda, directly financing the opposition Jamaica Labour Party, providing that party's leadership with strategic political guidance, and funneling money to influence factions inside the Jamaican military and police. It described using a covert international network of assets to publicly amplify Manley's ties to Cuba and the Soviet Union, whether or not those ties reflected the actual scope of Jamaica's foreign policy. Read that back for a moment, because it deserves to sit with you. The government of the United States was paying Jamaican media outlets to shape what Jamaican citizens believed about their own elected government. It was directly financing the political party running against that government. It was advising that party strategically on how to defeat the man Jamaicans had twice elected by landslide. And it was doing every bit of this while publicly, repeatedly denying any interference in Jamaica's internal affairs whatsoever. The mechanics of the operation, once fully documented, revealed a level of coordination that went far beyond simple propaganda. Declassified cables describe regular contact between American intelligence officers and Jamaica Labour Party strategists discussing messaging, timing, and tactics ahead of key political moments. Funds were funneled through intermediary organizations designed to obscure their original source, a standard tradecraft technique meant to give the American government what intelligence officers call plausible deniability, the ability to publicly deny involvement while privately directing it. Economic pressure was applied in parallel channels as well. International lending decisions, tourism promotion, and trade relationships all became, according to multiple accounts from officials involved at the time, tools used to squeeze the Jamaican economy at precisely the moments when squeezing it would do the most political damage to Manley's government. This was not a single covert action. It was a sustained multi-front campaign that touched media, politics, security forces, and the economy all at once, coordinated over a period of years. In July of 1980, an editor from the Washington-based Covert Action Information Bulletin held a press conference in Kingston and did something almost unheard of. He read out the names, home addresses, and vehicle license plates of 15 Americans he identified as CIA officers actively operating inside Jamaica. 2 days later, the home of the man identified as the CIA station chief in Kingston was shot at and bombed. Within a matter of weeks, the families of at least 6 of those 15 identified individuals had quietly packed up and left the island. A former CIA case officer named Philip Agee later stated on the public record that the agency had supplied weapons to supporters of the Jamaica Labour Party, and the political violence that would soon turn entire neighborhoods of Kingston into war zones does not appear, according to the evidence, to have grown organically. It appears to have been irrigated. So what, specifically, was the CIA actually afraid of? Because the declassified paper trail reveals something that runs deeper than a simple fear of communism. According to State Department records from the period, American policymakers were genuinely alarmed by the way Manley's democratic socialism was exposing class divisions, and, in the words of the documents themselves, empowering black Jamaicans politically and economically. They feared explicitly that this model could spread across the wider Caribbean. The real threat, in other words, was never a Soviet missile silo. There was never going to be one. The real threat was an idea. The idea that a small black Caribbean nation could redistribute its own wealth, reclaim its own natural resources, and stand as a genuine equal among the nations of the world. If Jamaica proved that was possible, who might be next? Barbados, Trinidad, Guyana. The dominoes Washington feared falling across the Caribbean in the 1970s were not communist regimes. They were liberated black populations discovering they had leverage. Back in Kingston, while all of this was unfolding in the shadows, Michael Manley was trying to hold his entire vision together as the floor quietly gave way beneath him. And here the story demands something most retellings refuse to offer: honesty about two uncomfortable truths existing at the exact same time. The CIA's destabilization campaign against Jamaica was real, extensively documented, and deliberate. The Jamaican economy was also, independently, being badly damaged by decisions Manley's own government had made. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and neither one cancels the other out. Inflation, which had sat at 8.2% in 1972, exploded to nearly 27% by 1973 alone, driven substantially by the global oil crisis. Jamaica had no domestic energy reserves of its own. Every barrel of oil the island needed had to be imported, and after OPEC's 1973 embargo, those prices became punishing. Foreign exchange reserves, which had stood at a healthy $239 million when Manley first took office, began hemorrhaging. Investment collapsed. Personal savings evaporated. Unemployment climbed toward 27%. Manley's social programs were humane, necessary, and genuinely transformative for the people they reached. But they were also expensive, and they were increasingly funded through deficit spending inside an economy that could no longer absorb deficits. The bauxite levy helped, but global bauxite prices were also falling during this exact period, undercutting the very revenue stream Manley was counting on. The math, quite simply, stopped working. Faced with a choice between dismantling the social programs he had built his entire political identity around, or turning to the International Monetary Fund for an emergency bailout, Manley chose the IMF. That choice arrived with brutal conditions attached: a 30% devaluation of the Jamaican dollar, sweeping cuts to public spending, and mass layoffs of public sector workers. The austerity that followed landed hardest on the exact people Manley had entered politics promising to protect. This is the complicated truth of Michael Manley, and it deserves to be told without flattening it in either direction. He was a man of genuine moral courage, someone who sat across from the most powerful diplomat on earth and refused to trade his country's principles for $100 million. He was also a leader whose idealism at moments outran his country's actual economic capacity, a man whose policy execution did not always match the scale of his vision. He was not a saint. He was a human being attempting something extraordinarily difficult, inside circumstances specifically engineered to make it fail. And through all of it, he held on to something rarer in politics than any economic statistic could measure: his dignity. In 1976, with violence spreading through Kingston, with CIA-linked weapons flowing into garrison communities, with the economy tightening and hostile press calling him an aspiring dictator, Manley declared a state of emergency, arrested individuals his government believed were actively plotting to destabilize the country, and called a snap election. He stood in front of a massive crowd on the People's National Party platform and told them 4 words that would define the campaign: "We are not for sale." The crowd's response, by every account from that night, was thunderous. The December 1976 election, held while that state of emergency was still technically in effect, returned the People's National Party to power decisively. 47 seats to the Jamaica Labour Party's 13. Despite the guns, despite the propaganda campaign, despite the mounting economic pressure, the people of Jamaica had chosen Michael Manley for a second time. Washington had not won, not yet. Now, before we move into the most dramatic chapter of this entire story, I want to ask you something, because this is the kind of moment worth sitting with. If a foreign government spent years secretly financing propaganda against your elected leadership, arming political factions, and manipulating your press, and you found out years later through declassified documents, what would you want your own country to do with that knowledge? Would you want it taught in schools? Would you want an apology? Or has too much time passed for either to matter? Leave your honest answer in the comments below, because these are the questions Jamaican historians are still wrestling with today, and I would genuinely like to know what you think. October the 16th, 1977, Victoria Pier, Kingston Harbor. A Cuban naval vessel sits docked in port, and the Cuban national anthem rises into the air, performed by the band of the 1st Battalion of the Jamaica Regiment. A crowd presses hard against the barriers along the waterfront, cheering, waving flags, climbing onto the rooftops of the Scotiabank building and the Intercontinental Hotel just to catch a glimpse of who is about to step off that ship. Armed soldiers are stationed on rooftops the entire length of Harbor Street, the tightest security Kingston has seen in years. Fidel Castro steps down onto Jamaican soil, and the crowd noise hits the sky. This is not a secret diplomatic backchannel. This is not a quiet arrangement handled discreetly through intermediaries. This is a full official state visit, and it marks the first time in history that the leader of communist Cuba has set foot on the soil of a Commonwealth Caribbean nation as an invited, honored guest of the government. Governor General Sir Florizel Glasspool stands ready to receive him. Michael Manley stands at his side. The motorcade moves from the pier, up King Street, through National Heroes Park, and thousands of ordinary Jamaicans line every inch of that route just to watch it pass. Over the course of a 5-day visit, Castro breaks ground on 188 new 2-bedroom homes being built with Cuban assistance at Mount Salem in Montego Bay. He tours a Jamaican urban farming project. He walks the Reynolds bauxite mines and greets the workers directly. He delivers a 90-minute address to a packed rally at Sam Sharp Square in Montego Bay, a square named for a Jamaican national hero who led an enslaved people's rebellion a century and a half earlier. And in a formal ceremony at King's House, Governor General Glasspool personally confers upon Fidel Castro the Order of Jamaica, one of the highest honors the nation can bestow, in recognition of Cuba's contributions to Jamaican infrastructure and professional training. Standing in the receiving line that day, present for the entire welcoming ceremony, was the American ambassador to Jamaica, Frederick Irving. In what has to rank among the most surreal diplomatic moments of the entire Cold War, the ambassador was personally introduced to Fidel Castro on Jamaican soil by Prime Minister Michael Manley himself, the CIA's single most wanted revolutionary on the planet. Shaking hands with the United States ambassador at Jamaica's invitation, Washington was not amused. By 1977, the relationship between Cuba and Jamaica had grown into something far more substantive than ideological solidarity. Cuban doctors were working in rural Jamaican communities that had never once had consistent access to medical care. Cuban construction crews and engineers were building housing for Jamaica's poor. Cuban teachers were standing in front of Jamaican classrooms. Cuban fishing experts were helping Jamaica develop an industry it had never fully capitalized on. Cuba offered full scholarships to Jamaican students to study medicine and other disciplines in Havana, entirely free of charge to the Jamaican government. The most lasting symbol of that relationship still stands today, the Jose Marti Technical High School, built with Cuban assistance and named for the Cuban poet and revolutionary who fought for Caribbean liberation in the 19th century. This was never a propaganda monument. It became one of the largest technical high schools in the country, training generations of Jamaican students in construction, welding, electronics, and other trades that gave them real, marketable futures. When the incoming JLP government severed diplomatic relations with Cuba in 1981, the school did not close, it kept teaching. It is still open today. Manley presented Castro with the Order of Jamaica because he genuinely believed what Cuba was doing on the island represented friendship between two peoples, not a geopolitical chess move. History has largely vindicated that belief. But he was also politically vulnerable for being right about it, because in Washington, every single Cuban doctor working in a rural Jamaican clinic was interpreted not as humanitarian aid, but as a communist soldier quietly advancing on American interests. The relationship also pulled both nations deeper into the non-aligned movement, the extraordinary international project of the 1970s in which dozens of newly independent nations across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean attempted to chart a path between Washington and Moscow, refusing full allegiance to either superpower. At the movement's 1979 summit, Manley delivered a speech that alarmed even some of his closest allies, pushing hard for a formal alliance between the non-aligned movement and the Soviet Union to jointly resist what he called imperialism. It was exactly the kind of rhetoric that handed Washington's narrative fresh ammunition, the claim that Manley was drifting from democratic socialism toward something considerably more radical. This honestly stands as one of Manley's genuine flaws as a leader. His moral clarity on issues like Angola and apartheid was extraordinary and, in hindsight, largely correct. His economic instincts about resource sovereignty were, in many respects, ahead of their time. but his rhetoric occasionally outpaced his actual policy, and every time it did, it handed his enemies precisely the ammunition they needed. By the late 1970s, the dominant story about Jamaica circulating through Washington and much of the Western press was no longer a story about a small island trying to reclaim its sovereignty and lift its poorest citizens. It had become, in the retelling, a story about a communist foothold quietly forming in America's own backyard. And exhausted by austerity, frightened by daily violence, and worn down by chronic shortages of basic goods, a growing number of Jamaicans began to believe that version of events too. By 1980, Jamaica was bleeding from nearly every artery at once. The IMF austerity program was crushing working-class and middle-class families alike. Inflation had peaked at 49.4% in 1978. Total public debt as a share of GDP had grown by nearly 500% since Manley first took office. Foreign exchange reserves were not simply depleted, they were negative. The economy had contracted in 7 of Manley's 8 years as Prime Minister. By 1980, Jamaica's gross domestic product was 17.5% smaller in real terms than it had been back in 1972. That is not an ordinary recession. That is an economic catastrophe unfolding in slow motion in full public view. For ordinary Jamaicans, the numbers translated into something much more immediate than a statistic in a government report. It meant standing in line for hours outside a grocery store for basic items like flour, cooking oil, and powdered milk, only to find the shelves bare when you finally reached the front. It meant families who had never once needed government assistance now depending on it simply to eat. It meant watching neighbors who had spent decades building small businesses close their doors, one after another, as imported materials became impossible to afford and foreign currency became nearly impossible to obtain through legal channels. A black market in foreign exchange, quietly known across the island simply as the parallel market, ballooned into a shadow economy of its own, with the real value of the Jamaican dollar on the street falling far below its official rate. This was the daily texture of life in Kingston by the end of the decade, and it is essential to understanding why so many exhausted, frightened Jamaicans eventually turned away from the government that had once given them so much hope, and the political violence had become something that defies easy description. By the time the general election of October 30th, 1980 finally arrived, official police statistics recorded 844 people murdered in politically motivated violence that year alone. Some independent analysts believe the true number was considerably higher. Entire garrison communities in West Kingston had effectively become urban war zones. Gangs aligned with both the PNP and the JLP, armed with weapons that the CIA's own declassified documents implicate American channels in supplying, were fighting what amounted to a low-grade civil war in the streets. The One Love Peace concert of 1978, where Bob Marley famously brought Manley and JLP leader Edward Seaga together on stage to clasp hands in front of 80,000 people, had been one desperate moment of hope in the middle of a killing season that never actually stopped. The Jamaica Labour Party's 1980 campaign slogan was blunt: "Deliverance is near." Edward Seaga, Harvard-educated, American-born, closely aligned with Ronald Reagan's incoming conservative administration in Washington, promised to restore economic stability, attract foreign investment back to the island, and permanently end what he called the socialist experiment that had, in his framing, driven Jamaica to ruin. The morning after the election, the scale of the PNP's defeat was staggering. The Jamaica Labour Party won 51 of 60 seats. Seaga had not simply won an election, he had ended an era. Ronald Reagan, elected to the American presidency just 4 days after Seaga's own victory, welcomed the new Jamaican Prime Minister to Washington with extraordinary warmth. Seaga became the very first foreign head of government Reagan formally received at the White House after taking office in January of 1981. It was a diplomatic signal as unmistakable as any written communique. Jamaica, in Washington's eyes, had finally been brought back into the fold. Within a year, Seaga severed diplomatic ties with Cuba entirely, formally ending the relationship Manley had spent the better part of a decade building. Cuban construction workers packed up and went home. The cooperative agreements that had built homes, staffed clinics, and educated a generation of Jamaican students wound down, one program at a time. American aid, by contrast, began flowing back into the island almost immediately, and Jamaica's relationship with Washington returned to something resembling its old, familiar shape. But something had shifted permanently. even if it did not show up in any treaty or trade agreement. The documents proving what the United States government had actually done inside Jamaica during the 1970s did not surface all at once. They emerged slowly, over years, through freedom of information requests, through investigative journalists who refused to let the story die, through former intelligence officers willing to speak on the record decades after the fact. The ripple effects extended well beyond Jamaica's shores. Across the Caribbean, other newly independent governments watched what had happened to Manley's experiment and drew their own conclusions. In Grenada, a small island nation not far from Jamaica, a young revolutionary named Maurice Bishop was already building his own movement, one that would seize power in 1979 and attempt many of the same structural reforms Manley had attempted years earlier: land redistribution, literacy campaigns, closer ties with Cuba. Bishop studied what had happened in Jamaica closely, and he understood the risks he was taking on. 4 years later, in October of 1983, Bishop was executed in a violent internal coup, and the United States, under President Reagan, used the resulting chaos as justification for a full military invasion of Grenada, the first direct American combat deployment in the Caribbean since the 1960s. Whatever lesson Washington intended small nations across the region to draw from what happened first in Jamaica and then in Grenada, the lesson was received. Throughout the 1980s, Caribbean leaders across the political spectrum grew visibly more cautious about how far they were willing to push against American economic and political interests, regardless of what their own citizens actually needed. By the time the full picture of the Jamaican operation came into focus, Michael Manley had already lived to see much of it confirmed. He returned to office again in 1989, this time governing with a far more pragmatic, market-friendly approach, having watched firsthand what happened to a small nation that tried to build an alternative to the existing order without the economic shock absorbers to survive the backlash. He died in March of 1997, having spent his final years reflecting publicly and with remarkable honesty on both what his government achieved and where it fell short. Here is what remains true, regardless of where you land on Manley's economic record. A small island nation of roughly 2 million people with no army capable of threatening anyone, no nuclear ambitions, and no oil beneath its soil, was treated by the most powerful government on earth as a genuine strategic threat, worthy of a sustained multi-year covert operation that spanned 2 separate American presidential administrations. Not because Jamaica posed a military danger to anyone, it never could have, but because Jamaica posed something Washington apparently found far more threatening: proof of concept. Proof that a small, formerly colonized, majority black nation could renegotiate the terms of its own exploitation, redirect its own natural resource wealth toward its own people, and still survive as a functioning democracy, holding free elections throughout the entire ordeal. That proof terrified people in Washington, precisely because it was not theoretical. It was happening in real time on an island most Americans could not have located on a map. And when it started working, when the bauxite levy actually generated the revenue Manley said it would, when schools actually got built and literacy actually climbed, the response from the most powerful nation in the world was not engagement. It was not negotiation. It was a quiet, sustained campaign to make sure the experiment failed before other nations started asking why they could not try the same thing. Whether you believe Michael Manley was ultimately a hero undone by forces beyond his control, or a well-intentioned leader whose ambition outran his country's economic capacity, one fact sits underneath both interpretations and cannot be argued away. He was never given the chance to fail or succeed entirely on his own terms. Somewhere in Langley, Virginia in the 1970s, a decision was made that a small Caribbean democracy exercising its own sovereign choices was too dangerous an example to be allowed to stand unopposed. And for the better part of a decade, the United States government acted on that decision, in the shadows against a nation that had never once threatened it with anything more than an idea. If this is the first time you are hearing this story in full, with the documents, the dates, and the names attached, you are not alone, and that is exactly the gap this channel exists to close. If you want more stories like this one, stories that sit at the intersection of Caribbean history and global power, consider subscribing and joining us as we work toward 10,000 subscribers together. And before you go, I want to leave you with the same question we asked earlier. because it is worth sitting with a little longer this time. If you had been Michael Manley, sitting across from Henry Kissinger in December of 1975, with your country's foreign reserves nearly gone and $100 million sitting on the table in exchange for your silence, what would you have done? Tell me honestly in the comments, because the answer is not as easy as it sounds from this distance, decades later, with all the documents already in hand. Thank you for spending this time with us and for letting this story, buried for so long in classified files and half-remembered headlines, finally get told in full.